My dad said my 280K was gone forever. He didn't know the audit was already underway. The moment the words left his mouth, that $280,000 was no longer just a number. It was a chasm, a gaping, echoing void that opened up between my father and me. And I knew, with a sickening certainty that settled like lead in my stomach, that nothing would ever be the same. It was Christmas Eve, the kind of night that's supposed to be steeped in twinkling lights and the aroma of pine. But all I could smell was the stale air of his study, thick with the scent of expensive paper and guilt. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, the kind that commands a room, just like he did. His face, usually a mask of stoic control, was etched with something I'd never seen before, a flicker of desperation, quickly masked by an icy indifference. "It's gone, Sarah," he'd repeated, his voice flat, devoid of any real remorse. "Investments went south. Bad call. You're just going to have to accept it." He didn't look at me. He never looked at me when he delivered bad news, especially news that affected his legacy. My $280,000, the inheritance from my grandmother, the one he'd managed, the one he'd promised was growing, the one I'd meticulously planned to use for a down payment on a small condo near the city, a place that would finally be mine, had evaporated into the ether of his financial misadventures. My world up until that point had been a carefully curated landscape of privilege. We lived in a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Connecticut, the kind of place where the lawns were manicured by a silent army of gardeners, and the family gatherings felt more like corporate board meetings. My father, Arthur Sterling, was a titan of industry. He built Sterling Holdings from the ground up, a name synonymous with shrewd investments and ruthless ambition. My mother, Eleanor, a polished and perpetually elegant woman, was the perfect complement, orchestrating charity galas and maintaining the family's impeccable social standing. And then there was me, Sarah, the quiet one who preferred books to balls, who'd always felt a subtle disconnect from the grand pronouncements and unspoken expectations that permeated our household. My older brother, David, was the heir apparent, groomed from birth to take the reins of Sterling Holdings, his life a mirror image of our father's, only with more confidence and less introspection. I was different. I'd always felt like an afterthought, a decorative piece in the Sterling tableau. But I was also smart. I worked hard. I'd graduated top of my class, gotten a respectable job in a law firm downtown. Not the high-powered corporate law my father championed, but something quieter, more grounded, something that felt like mine. And that $280,000 was supposed to be my first real step towards independence, a tangible symbol that I wasn't entirely beholden to the Sterling fortune. When Grandma Evelyn passed, she'd left specific instructions.
Her assets were to be divided equally among her grandchildren, with my father acting as trustee for those of us who were still minors, or, in my case, for funds he was to manage until I reached a certain age, or had a specific financial goal in mind. He'd always been so smooth about it, so reassuring. "Don't worry about a thing, Sarah Bunn," he'd say, his arms slung around my shoulders, a gesture that always felt a little too tight, a little too possessive. "Your grandmother's legacy is in good hands. Just focus on your studies." I trusted him, implicitly. Why wouldn't I? He was my father. He was Arthur Sterling. The revelation of the lost money wasn't delivered with dramatic flair or a tearful apology. It was a casual dismissal, a Tuesday afternoon after the usual Christmas Eve festivities had wound down, leaving behind a residue of forced cheer and strained conversations. David had already flown back to his penthouse in the city, probably already strategizing his next big merger. My mother was busy with her staff, ensuring the estate was perfectly in order for the incoming new year. I'd stayed behind, hoping for a quiet moment with my father to discuss the condo purchase, to finally share my excitement. Instead, I got the truth, delivered with the same practice efficiency he used to close a deal. He'd pushed a folder across the desk, its cover nondescript, plain manila. "These are the quarterly reports," he'd said, not bothering to open it. "As you can see, things haven't performed as expected." I'd picked it up, my fingers tracing the embossed Sterling Holdings logo. The figures inside swam before my eyes, a blur of red ink and casualty. I'd scanned the pages, looking for an explanation, a lifeline, anything. But the numbers spoke a language of their own, a language of ruin. What happened?" I'd managed to stammer, my voice barely a whisper. He'd sighed, a theatrical sound that conveyed his immense burden. The market, Sarah. Volatile. We had a significant exposure in the tech sector. A few key companies tanked. It was a calculated risk, of course, but the downside was substantial. He paused, finally meeting my gaze, and I saw it then. The cold, hard calculation behind the mask. There was no regret, no empathy, just the detached assessment of a failed venture. The $280,000 you had with me, it was part of a larger portfolio. When that portfolio took a hit, everything within it was absorbed. Absorbed. The word hung in the air, sterile and brutal. It implied a passive consumption, as if the money had simply been swallowed by some impersonal force. But I knew better. I knew my father. His risks were never passive. They were bold, often reckless, and always driven by an insatiable hunger for more. He gambled, not with dice, but with figures on a spreadsheet, and sometimes he lost. And when he lost, it wasn't his own fortune he risked first. So, it's gone? I asked, the words catching in my throat. All of it?
He gave a curt nod. Gone forever, Sarah. I'm afraid that's the reality. He stood up, a signal that the conversation was over, that I was dismissed. We'll discuss your allowance for next year. Perhaps we can adjust your expectations. Allowance. The word was a slap in the face. I was a grown woman, a professional. My grandmother's legacy, my own hard-earned savings, reduced to a childish allowance. Humiliation washed over me, hot and stinging. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to call out his deception. But the years of ingrained deference, the suffocating weight of sterling expectations, held me captive. I felt small, insignificant, utterly powerless. I nodded, a jerky, almost imperceptible movement, and turned to leave the study, the manila folder clutched in my numb fingers. The polished oak floor seemed to stretch into infinity, each step a heavier reminder of my dispossession. I walked out of his study and into the grand hall, the ornate chandelier casting long, accusatory shadows. The silence of the estate, usually a comforting balm, now felt oppressive, amplifying the hollowness inside me. I could hear my mother's distant laughter from the drawing room, a brittle sound that echoed the superficiality of our lives. David was gone, off to conquer his own empires, leaving me to navigate the wreckage of my father's ambition. As I walked through the silent rooms, the weight of the manila folder in my hand grew heavier. Gone forever. The words echoed in my mind, a cruel refrain. But something shifted within me as I moved through the shadows. A tiny ember of defiance, long dormant, began to glow. He thought he'd crushed me, that he'd reduced me to a dependent child once more. He thought he'd silenced me with his pronouncements of financial ruin, but he underestimated me. He always had. He saw me as the quiet daughter, the one who wouldn't make waves. He saw me as easy to dismiss, easy to control. He saw Sarah, the recipient of his misplaced trust. He didn't see Sarah, the junior associate at Sterling & Stern, the one who spent her days poring over complex financial documents, the one who understood the intricate dance of audits and disclosures. He didn't see Sarah, the one who, just 2 weeks prior, had been quietly, meticulously gathering evidence. The audit, that was the part he hadn't factored into his carefully constructed narrative of loss. My grandmother's will had been meticulous, but the management of her funds by my father had been less so. There were discrepancies, small at first, easily overlooked, but the more I dug, the more I found. The initial seed money for the Sterling Holdings empire, where had it really come from? Some of it, I suspected, had been earmarked for us, the grandchildren, long before we were aware of it. And my father, in his relentless pursuit of growth, had a habit of reallocating. I'd started my own quiet investigation, fueled by a growing unease and a stubborn refusal to let my inheritance simply vanish. I'd used my legal training, my access to public records, my understanding of financial obfuscation. It had been a clandestine operation, conducted in stolen moments after late nights at the firm, fueled by strong coffee and a simmering resentment. I'd cross-referenced transactions, traced shell corporations, and painstakingly documented every anomaly. The audit wasn't just a routine check, it was my counteroffensive.
It was the quiet storm building beneath the surface of Sterling's carefully manicured facade. I'd initiated the process through a trusted intermediary, a former colleague of my grandmother's, who had always been wary of Arthur's financial dealings. He'd agreed to help to ensure the audit was thorough, independent, and, most importantly, discreet. The final reports were due to land on my desk this week, and the preliminary findings, they were damning. My father hadn't just lost my $280,000. He'd likely mismanaged and potentially misappropriated a far larger sum, using my inheritance as a convenient scapegoat for his own financial recklessness, and I suspected his own personal indulgences. He'd presented his fiction of market volatility to me, but the audit was about to reveal the stark, undeniable reality of his deception. I stood there in the silent hall, the Christmas tree lights twinkling, the echoes of his dismissals still ringing in my ears. Gone forever, he'd said. The arrogance of it, the sheer, unadulterated belief that he could simply erase my inheritance, my trust, my future, with a few well-chosen words. He'd created a narrative of loss, a tragic tale of market forces beyond his control, but he hadn't accounted for the auditor's pen, for the cold, hard facts that were about to lay bare his meticulously constructed lie. He'd underestimated the quiet daughter. He'd underestimated the power of a woman scorned, a woman betrayed, a woman who had finally found her voice, not in a scream, but in a meticulously crafted legal brief. I looked down at the manila folder, the weight of it now feeling less like a burden and more like a weapon. I wasn't going to accept this. I wasn't going to be silenced. My father had built his empire on secrets and control, but he had forgotten one crucial element. Secrets, like money, have a way of resurfacing, and this time they were coming back with interest. I pictured his face, the flicker of desperation he tried so hard to hide. He thought he'd won, that he'd deftly maneuvered me into accepting his financial failure. He was wrong. He was so profoundly wrong. He had no idea that the audit, the very instrument he believed had legitimized his story of loss, was about to become the instrument of his undoing. The house was quiet, but inside me, a storm was brewing. He'd sown the wind, and now he was about to reap the whirlwind.
I took a deep breath, the scent of pine and expensive polish replaced by something sharper, something exhilarating, revenge. It tasted like victory, and part 2 was going to be devastating. The manila folder felt heavier in my hand as I walked away from my father's study, a smug, dangerous calm settling over me. Gone forever. Such a definitive, absolute phrase. He delivered it like a death sentence. But for me, it was the starting pistol. The sheer audacity of his deception, painting himself as the victim of market whims, when the truth was likely far uglier, ignited a cold fury that burned away the initial shock and hurt. It was like finding a hidden trapdoor beneath a beautifully tiled floor. He expected me to stumble, to lament, to beg. Instead, I was already strategizing my descent into his meticulously crafted labyrinth. My father, Arthur Sterling, was a man who operated on layers of carefully constructed personas: the benevolent patriarch, the shrewd investor, the pillar of society. But beneath it all, he was a gambler, a man whose ego was as vast and unstable as the markets he claimed to master. And he believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was untouchable. He'd always treated my grandmother's inheritance with a casual disdain, a fund he managed more for his own convenience and ego than for her beneficiaries. He'd poured money into his own ventures, undoubtedly viewing it as seed capital, a resource to be leveraged. My $280,000 was just a drop in his ocean of ambition, a drop he'd apparently lost, and then decided to simply absorb. The audit wasn't merely an investigation into my lost inheritance. It was an exploration of the Sterling Holdings financial ecosystem, a system my father had lorded over for decades. He'd always been cagey about the details, deflecting my infrequent inquiries with vague pronouncements about proprietary information and market sensitivity. My role as the quiet one, the daughter who wasn't slated for succession, had afforded me a certain invisibility within the corporate hierarchy, a privilege I now wielded like a scalpel. While David was being groomed to understand the macro picture, the deals, the mergers, I was the one with an eye for the granular, the footnotes, the tiny inconsistencies that, in the grand scheme, could unravel an entire enterprise. The preliminary findings from the audit, delivered via encrypted email from my intermediary, were already far more damning than I had anticipated. It wasn't just my money. Arthur Sterling, it seemed, had a habit of dipping into trust funds for his own purposes. My grandmother's will had stipulated that certain funds were to be held in trust for her grandchildren, with the interest to be reinvested and the principal accessible only under specific circumstances.
Arthur, however, had treated these accounts as an extension of his own liquid assets, strategically moving funds, obscurely documenting them as advances or intercompany loans that never seemed to get repaid. My $280,000 wasn't just a casualty of a bad investment, it was a part of a larger pattern of financial chicanery, a pattern that likely involved millions of dollars. The audit was uncovering a web of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and dubious transactions that pointed to a systematic siphoning of funds, not just from my grandmother's estate, but potentially from other beneficiaries and even company profits, all disguised under the guise of aggressive investment strategies. He had lied about the market. The market hadn't absorbed my money. He had absorbed it, along with God knows what else, and then invented a convenient narrative to cover his tracks. The thought sent a fresh wave of icy rage through me. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the blatant, calculated betrayal of trust. He had looked me in the eye and spun a tale of woe, a fabrication designed to silence my questions and maintain his image. The manila folder, once a symbol of my dispossession, now felt like a ticking time bomb. I spent the next few days in a state of hypervigilance. Every interaction with my family felt charged with a new, unnerving energy. My mother, Eleanor, noticed my subdued demeanor, attributing it to the usual post-holiday slump. "You're quiet, Sarah, darling," she'd said over breakfast, her voice laced with a familiar, almost practiced concern. "Is everything all right? Did Arthur say something about the condo?" I'd merely offered a tight smile and a vague assurance, my mind racing through the audit's implications. My mother, for all her social grace and outward elegance, was a master of willful ignorance, adept at maintaining the sterling illusion. She benefited from Arthur's wealth, from the sterling name, and I doubted she had any desire to peer too deeply into the foundations upon which it was built. David was even more detached. He called once, his voice buzzing with self-importance. "Heard about the market correction, Sarah. Tough break. Dad's taking a bit of a hit, I think. He's going to need to be smart about this. That's why I'm telling you. This is a prime time for acquisitions. The undervalued assets are ripe for the picking. Sterling Holdings needs to move fast." He spoke of financial turmoil as if it were a chess game, a strategic opportunity. He had no idea that the turmoil was largely manufactured, and that the man he admired was not a victim, but a perpetrator. The real shift in power wasn't a sudden, dramatic confrontation. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of my father's control, a dismantling of his carefully constructed facade from the inside. I started attending family meetings, usually reserved for discussing major financial decisions and Arthur's pronouncements, with a newfound purpose. Before, I'd sat silently, a polite observer. Now I listened with a forensic ear. I began asking questions, not accusatory, not yet, but probing, clarifying questions that subtly highlighted inconsistencies in his narratives. "Dad," I'd say, my voice calm and measured, "you mentioned that the tech sector losses were significant. Could you clarify which specific investments were most impacted? I'm trying to understand the exposure Sterling Holdings had in that particular area." He'd wave a dismissive hand. "It's complicated, Sarah. A portfolio of smaller, interconnected firms. Not something you'd be familiar with." But Grandma Evelyn's will stipulated a portion of her estate was invested in a diversified portfolio. Was that portion included in this particular tech sector investment? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The trust funds were managed collectively, Sarah, for efficiency." Efficiency, I'd echo, letting the word hang in the air. My intermediary had confirmed that Arthur had a history of commingling funds, trading trust assets as his own personal slush fund. He'd been particularly adept at using the efficiency argument to justify his actions. One evening, during a tense discussion about an upcoming acquisition my father was pushing through Sterling Holdings, he made a pronouncement that was so arrogant, so dismissive of any potential dissent, that it solidified my resolve. He was outlining the financial projections, his tone leaving no room for debate. "The projections are clear," he declared, tapping a thick binder. "We acquire this company, we leverage their patents, we're looking at a 30% increase in market share within 18 months. There is no alternative. This is happening." David nodded in agreement, already picturing the headlines. My mother offered a placid smile, the picture of an accommodating wife. But I saw it then, the suffocating control he exerted. He wasn't just making business decisions, he was dictating the lives and futures of everyone associated with Sterling Holdings, all built on a foundation of lies and misappropriated wealth. That night, I decided it was time to escalate. The audit's deeper findings had revealed something particularly egregious. Arthur had systematically undervalued certain assets of Sterling Holdings, including a prime piece of real estate in Manhattan that had been acquired decades ago with funds that were heavily drawn from my grandmother's initial investment capital. This undervaluation wasn't just poor management, it was a deliberate act to keep certain profitable entities from accruing significant value on paper, making them less visible and easier to move or sell discreetly. The audit's forensic accountants had discovered evidence of inflated expenses and creative accounting designed to obscure the true profitability of these assets. It was a level of deception that went far beyond a simple lost investment.
He wasn't just stealing from us. He was actively manipulating the value of the entire enterprise. I called my intermediary. "I need the full financial breakdown of that Manhattan property," I instructed, my voice low and urgent. "Every appraisal, every transaction, every expense report for the last 20 years. And I need to know the original source of the funds used for its initial acquisition, cross-referenced with Grandma Evelyn's trust accounts from that period." The next few days were a blur of legal documents, encrypted files, and clandestine meetings. The intermediary delivered. The truth was stark. The Manhattan property, a prestigious office building, had been acquired using a substantial portion of my grandmother's principal, funds that had been explicitly designated for long-term growth and eventual distribution. Arthur had then proceeded to systematically underreport its value through a series of shell corporations and complex, opaque accounting maneuvers. The rental income generated by the property, a substantial sum each year, had been funneled through these offshore entities, rarely making its way back to the Sterling Holdings primary accounts in a way that reflected its true worth. My $280,000 in this context was a drop in a much larger bucket of financial malfeasance. He hadn't just lost my money, he'd been actively pilfering from his own company and from the trusts he was meant to safeguard for years, using my inheritance as a convenient scapegoat for a fraction of his transgressions. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The sheer scale of his deceit, the years of calculated manipulation, the audacity of his continued lies. He had played us all, a master puppeteer pulling strings from behind a gilded curtain. The humiliation I had felt on Christmas Eve was nothing compared to this profound sense of betrayal, of being a pawn in a game I hadn't even known was being played. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't confront him directly, not yet. I needed to gather irrefutable proof, to build a case so solid, so undeniable, that it would shatter his carefully constructed world. The audit was my weapon, and I intended to wield it with precision. I began to systematically request specific financial documents from Sterling Holdings, citing my role as a beneficiary of my grandmother's estate and my concern over the reported financial downturn. My father, still believing I was a naive victim, begrudgingly complied, likely seeing it as a way to pacify me. He was about to learn that my concerns were far more informed than he imagined. The turning point came during a large family gathering, a typically elaborate Sterling affair, this time ostensibly to celebrate the new year and Arthur's recent business triumphs. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the clinking of champagne glasses. David was holding court, regaling a small group with tales of his latest acquisition.
My mother was circulating, a picture of serene matriarchal grace. My father, Arthur, stood at the center of the room, basking in the adulation, the undisputed king of his domain. I sat at a small side table, nursing a glass of water, the final audit report spread discreetly beneath a linen napkin. The document detailed the specific transactions related to the Manhattan property, the offshore accounts, and the undervalued assets. It was a roadmap of Arthur Sterling's financial crimes. Then my father made a careless comment. He was talking about the uncertainty of the market and how prudent management was crucial. He glanced at me, a patronizing smile playing on his lips. "Sarah here is learning a valuable lesson about financial realities," he announced, his voice carrying across the room. "Not everything is as stable as it appears." Something snapped. The quiet rage, the meticulously built control, fractured. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the polished marble floor. All eyes turned to me. The festive chatter died down. My father's patronizing smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. Actually, Dad, I said, my voice cutting through the sudden silence, clear and steady, I've been learning a lot more than just financial realities. I've been learning about your financial realities. A hush fell over the room. My father's eyes narrowed. Sarah, this is not the time or place for, oh, but I think it's precisely the time and place, I continued, my gaze fixed on him. I reached for the napkin, my hands trembling slightly, and pulled out the thick stack of audit reports. The room seemed to hold its breath. You told me my $280,000 was gone forever, a casualty of your investments. But this audit, conducted by independent forensic accountants, reveals a very different story. I held up the first page, the Sterling Holdings logo stark against the stark white paper. It seems my inheritance was merely a small piece of a much larger picture. A picture involving the systematic undervaluation of Sterling Holdings assets, including the Manhattan property, for the past 2 decades. A picture involving offshore accounts and disguised income streams. A picture that suggests my grandmother's principal funds, and likely millions more, have been systematically diverted for your personal use, not lost in a market downturn. My father's face contorted, his carefully constructed composure shattering. His eyes, usually so sharp and commanding, were wide with disbelief and dawning horror. He took a step back, as if physically struck. My mother stood frozen, her hand halfway to her mouth, her painted smile gone, replaced by a mask of sheer bewilderment. David, who had been so confident moments before, now looked utterly stunned, his jaw slack. The guests, the friends, the business associates, all stared, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. This is preposterous, my father stammered, his voice hoarse.
You've been misled. These are fabricated documents. Are they? I asked, my voice gaining strength. I have transaction records, offshore incorporation papers, independent appraisal reports that contradict every valuation you've ever presented for that building. I have proof, Dad. Irrefutable proof of your deception. I saw it then, the dawning realization in his eyes. He hadn't accounted for this. He hadn't accounted for my quiet persistence, my legal training, my willingness to dig deep. He had underestimated me, dismissed me, and in doing so, he had sealed his own fate. The silence in the room was deafening, punctuated only by the frantic beating of my own heart. The carefully crafted world of Arthur Sterling was beginning to crumble, and I was holding the sledgehammer. You can't do this, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I'm not doing anything, Dad, I replied, my voice now a chillingly calm whisper that nonetheless carried to every corner of the room. The truth is doing this, and the truth, as it turns out, is a very powerful thing. I let the audit reports flutter to the table, each page a silent accusation. The festive lights seemed to dim, the opulent room suddenly feeling cold and hollow. He had built his empire on a foundation of lies, and now those lies were about to consume him. This was just the beginning. The real reckoning was yet to come. The silence that followed was a physical weight, pressing down on the once lively room. It wasn't the awkward silence of a social faux pas. It was the profound, deafening quiet that descends when a foundation of reality cracks. My father's face was a study in controlled panic, his eyes darting between the damning documents on the table and the stunned faces of his family and guests. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, a stark contrast to his usual commanding presence. David, his heir apparent, looked as though he'd been sucker-punched, his initial bravado evaporated, replaced by a pale, ashen disbelief. My mother's perfectly coiffed hair seemed to wilt, her porcelain features etched with a horror she could no longer conceal. This was not the usual family drama. This was a seismic event. I felt no triumph, not yet, just a cold, clear certainty. This was the culmination of years of quiet observation, of buried heart, of a deeply ingrained sense of injustice. The manila folder that had felt heavy with my father's lies now felt light, a mere catalyst. The true weight was in the meticulous work that followed, the late nights spent with lawyers, the cross-referencing of bank statements, the painstaking reconstruction of a financial history designed to be obscure. The intermediary, a sharp, discreet woman who understood the Sterling family's intricate web from years of working in their orbit, had been instrumental. She'd managed to access archived company records, former employee testimonies, and even discreetly obtain copies of Arthur Sterling's personal offshore account statements, all legally and with impeccable documentation. My father's arrogance had been his undoing. He treated the inheritance from Evelyn Sterling as a private slush fund, a mere footnote in his grand financial narrative. He'd been so convinced of his own infallibility, his ability to manipulate the system and everyone within it, that he'd forgotten the fundamental rule. Secrets, especially those involving vast sums of money, have a way of resurfacing. The audit had been my Trojan horse, slowly dismantling his defenses from within. The initial findings about my $280,000 were just the tip of a colossal iceberg. The Manhattan property was the linchpin. The audit had revealed that Arthur Sterling had indeed used funds directly traceable to Evelyn's trust accounts, acquired decades ago, to purchase the building. Over the years, he'd engaged in a systematic devaluation of this asset on Sterling Holdings' books. He'd created a series of shell corporations, registered in jurisdictions known for their financial secrecy, and channeled rental income and capital gains through them. The recorded income for the Sterling Holdings books was a fraction of the actual revenue generated by the building. He'd presented this artifice as prudent financial management, a testament to his skill in navigating complex markets. In reality, he was stealing from his own company, from his beneficiaries, and from himself, hiding wealth in plain sight. The documents I held were more than just financial statements. They were a testament to a life built on elaborate deception. They detailed the purchase of the building for $15 million in 1998, a sum that, according to Evelyn's trust records, had been significantly drawn from her principal. The current market valuation, conservatively estimated by independent appraisers due to the meticulous accounting of the forensic team, placed its worth closer to $150 million. The difference, $135 million, had effectively been laundered through Arthur Sterling's personal offshore empire. My $280,000 had been swallowed by this mall, a microscopic casualty in a grand theft. These documents, my father's voice cracked, his usual timbre replaced by a tremor of desperation. They are manipulated. You don't understand the complexities of international finance. I understand that you presented a property valued at $15 million to Sterling Holdings Board and to the IRS for years, I stated, my voice still unnervingly calm. Yet, independent valuations, backed by rental income records from the building's tenants, which we also have, show a consistent, significantly higher market value. You've been essentially gifting yourself millions of dollars by artificially depressing the value of a Sterling Holdings asset while channeling its true profits elsewhere. And the initial capital for that acquisition, it came from my grandmother's trust, the very trust you were supposed to safeguard. David stepped forward, his face a mask of confusion. Sarah, what are you talking about? Dad's been a brilliant investor. Sterling Holdings is at its peak. Is it, David? I turned to him, my expression softening slightly, a flicker of pity crossing my face. Or has it been artificially propped up by assets you've been led to believe are worth far less than they are? When the truth about this property comes out, and it will, Sterling Holdings' valuation will plummet. This isn't just about your personal greed, Dad. It's about financial fraud on a massive scale that impacts the entire company, and by extension, it impacts you and your future. My mother, Eleanor, finally found her voice, a small, weak sound. Arthur, is this true? About Evelyn's money? Arthur Sterling, the Titan, the man who had always projected an aura of unshakable authority, seemed to shrink before our eyes. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The color had drained from his face, leaving him ghostly pale. He looked like a man who had just seen his entire life's work crumbled into dust. You told me, I continued, my voice gaining a low, resonant power, that you were a victim of the market, that your investments had failed and my inheritance was lost. You painted yourself as a benevolent patriarch, struggling against forces beyond your control. But you weren't a victim, Dad. You were the predator, and I was one of your prey. I walked over to a grand piano in the corner of the ballroom, picking up a stray champagne flute from a nearby table. I turned it in my hand, the crystal catching the ambient light. You taught me so much, Dad.
You taught me about strategy, about foresight, about the importance of controlling the narrative. You just never taught me that you were the one writing the most insidious narrative of all. I looked directly at my father. The lawyers are already working on the paperwork. The forensic reports have been submitted to the SEC and the appropriate federal agencies. We've also alerted the board of Sterling Holdings. You'll have your chance to explain yourself to them, to the authorities, to the public. The mention of the SEC and federal agencies sent another wave of shock through the room. Arthur Sterling, the carefully constructed world, wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing. He stumbled backward, his hand reaching out as if to steady himself against an invisible wall. David, however, was starting to process. The initial shock was giving way to something else: anger, confusion, and a dawning sense of betrayal that mirrored my own. You would ruin him? Ruin the family name? He demanded, his voice rising. He ruined the family name long before I ever stepped foot in a courtroom, David, I said, meeting his gaze. He built this empire on a foundation of lies and stolen money. The name is already tainted.
I'm just bringing the truth to light. My mother was weeping now, silent tears streaming down her face. She looked utterly lost, her world of privilege and comfort dissolving before her eyes. My God, Arthur, all these years. The guests began to subtly, then not so subtly, retreat, their polite smiles replaced by expressions of shock and discomfort. The festive atmosphere had evaporated, leaving behind a palpable sense of dread. This was not a party, it was a judgment. This is insane, Arthur stammered, his voice a pathetic whisper. You're making a mistake, a terrible, terrible mistake. I took a slow sip of my champagne, the bubbly liquid a stark contrast to the grim reality unfolding. Mistakes? You're right, Dad. I've made mistakes. I trusted you. I believed in the Sterling name. I believed in you. That was my mistake. And you? You made a lot of mistakes. Cheating your own family, committing massive financial fraud, thinking you were untouchable. I placed the flute back on the table with a soft clink. The board will have to convene immediately. They'll see the reports. They'll have to act. Sterling Holdings can't survive this scandal without drastic restructuring. And as a major beneficiary of Evelyn's estate, with irrefutable proof of your malfeasance, I have significant leverage, more than you can imagine. The implication hung in the air, unspoken, but understood. The power had shifted irrevocably. Arthur Sterling was no longer the master of his domain. He was a defendant. And I, the quiet daughter, the one he'd always dismissed, was now the architect of his downfall. I'm not asking for an apology, my voice a low, steady hum that commanded attention. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm simply ensuring accountability, and I'm reclaiming what was mine and what was meant for others that you so brazenly misappropriated. I looked around at the stunned faces of my family, at the smoldering ruins of my father's carefully curated life. There was a profound sadness, but also a sense of liberation. The weight of his deceit had been a constant burden, a shadow I'd carried for years. Now it was lifting. David, I said, my voice softer now, almost gentle, when you take over Sterling Holdings, and you will, you'll have a chance to rebuild it, on a foundation of honesty. It will be a long road, but it's a start. He didn't respond, his eyes still wide with disbelief. He was a man adrift, his inheritance, his identity, his entire future thrown into question by his father's actions. I turned and walked towards the exit, leaving the hushed, stunned silence behind me. The ornate ballroom, once a symbol of Sterling wealth and power, now felt like a mausoleum. The chandeliers, usually so dazzling, cast long, somber shadows. My father stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the documents, his empire crumbling around him. My mother sobbed quietly, her world imploding. David looked lost, his face a canvas of confusion and dawning anger. Stepping out into the crisp night air, I took a deep, cleansing breath. The scent of expensive flowers and decaying illusions no longer clung to me. The journey had been long, arduous, and emotionally draining. There were no winners in this, not truly.
But there was justice, there was consequence, and there was a future, one and built on my own terms, free from the shadows of deception. The weight was gone. I was finally free.